There is a field in Egypt where nothing is supposed to be. No temple, no columns, no standing walls, just flat ground, a hard pale crust, and a mud brick pyramid slumping into the desert behind it like a candle left in the sun. Tour buses drive past it on the way to somewhere better. Most people walk right past it. Then, a survey team pushed radar into that ground and watched the screen fill up with straight lines. Not cracks, not bedrock, straight lines, right angles, long walls running parallel to each other, crossing at 90 degrees, closing off spaces. Rooms, room after room after room, sitting in the dark under the sand, arranged in a grid so regular that nature does not produce it by accident. They ran the survey again with different equipment. The pattern held. Then, the results were shut down. This was 2008. The site is called Hawara, in the Fayum, about 90 kilometers southwest of Cairo. The scanning was carried out by Egypt's own National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics, working with scientists from Ghent University in Belgium, under permit from the Supreme Council of Antiquities. This was not treasure hunting. This was a licensed scientific survey using ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and very low-frequency electromagnetic sounding. 3 separate methods pointed at the same patch of dirt. What came back was a grid of vertical walls, some of them several meters thick, forming almost closed rooms, spread across hectares of ground, sitting 8 to 12 meters beneath the surface. The material read as extremely high resistivity, dense, hard, the kind of return you get from granite. And here is the part that should make the back of your neck go cold. A Greek traveler stood on that exact patch of ground around 450 years before the Common Era and wrote that beneath his feet were 1,500 underground chambers, and that the keepers of the place would not let him go down and see them. Not a myth, not a metaphor. He wrote it as a complaint. He was irritated. He had walked the upper floor. He wanted the lower floor. And they told him no. 24 centuries later, a machine looked through the sand and found rooms exactly where he said they would be. The man who led that survey waited 2 years for the results to be published by the Egyptian authorities. They never were. All communication about the findings was stopped. The reason given was national security. So before this is over, I am going to show you 3 things. The first is another claim from that same ancient account, a claim historians laughed at for 2,000 years, until one man went to the exact spot described and dug it up. The second is what actually happened to the missing building, and why the explanation everyone accepted for over a century has a hole in it big enough to walk through. And the third is what is happening down there right now, tonight, while nobody digs. Because the problem is not only that the labyrinth is lost, the problem is that something is destroying it, slowly, and it is not looters. Start with the account itself, because everything turns on how you read it. The traveler is Herodotus. In the second book of his histories, he describes his tour of Egypt, and he has just finished writing about the pyramids at Giza. Then he says, the thing that has embarrassed his defenders ever since. He says, the pyramids are beyond description, that each one is worth many Greek monuments, and then he says, this building surpasses even the pyramids. He describes 12 roofed courts with their gates facing one another, 6 opening north and 6 opening south, joined in 2 continuous lines, all of it inside a single outer wall. He describes 3,000 chambers, 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below. He says he walked the upper set himself, and that the passages, courts, colonnades, and rooms folded into each other until he lost all sense of where he was. For centuries, this got filed under traveler's exaggeration. Greek tourist, hot day, big building, big numbers. But go back and read what he actually wrote, and it does not read like poetry. It reads like a man taking notes. He gives counts, he gives orientations, he gives the direction the doors face. He gives the arrangement of the courts inside one enclosure wall. He gives the split between upper and lower levels as a ratio. That is not awe. That is an inventory. He was not guessing. He was recording. And he was not alone. 400 years later, the geographer Strabo visited the same place and wrote his own description. And Strabo was a hard-headed man who spent most of his life describing trade routes and coastlines. He said the complex was made of many palaces, one for each province of Egypt. He said that in front of the entrances were long crypts with winding passages, so tangled that no visitor could find the way in or out without a guide. And he said something very specific about the construction. He said the roofs were made of single stones, not beams, not slabs joined together. Single stones, each covered passage roofed with one monolithic block of extraordinary size, and no wood used anywhere in the entire building. Then Pliny the Elder wrote about it, and Pliny made a claim that sounds absurd until you sit with it. He said the famous Labyrinth of Crete, the one from the legend, was a copy, and not a full copy. He said Crete reproduced maybe 100th part of the Egyptian original. He describes doors so heavy that opening them produced a sound like thunder, and passages that ran in darkness. 3 writers, centuries apart, different languages, different purposes, different politics. Same building, not similar, not borrowed from each other, the same. So here is the reframe, and it changes what you are looking for. Everyone hears the word labyrinth and pictures a maze, a puzzle, something built to confuse. But look at what the descriptions actually contain. 12 courts, one for each administrative province, according to Strabo. Endless small chambers arranged in rows. Long corridors running between them. Everything roofed in stone, with no timber anywhere, in a country where timber was the standard roofing material for anything that was not meant to last. That is not a puzzle. That is a filing system. Stone rooms in rows, fireproof, floodproof, sealed against damp, organized by province, attached to the tomb of the king who ran the entire operation. What you are hearing described is the administrative heart of a kingdom, the place where the records were kept, where the accounts of every province were held, where the grain and the water and the taxes of the richest agricultural region in the ancient world were governed from. To an Egyptian official, it was the office. To a Greek tourist with no paperwork and no guide, it was an infinite maze. Even the name points that way. Egyptologists have argued the Greek word comes from an Egyptian phrase meaning the temple at the mouth of the lake. Others trace it to the throne name of the king who built it. Amenemhat III ruled as Amenemhat, and later Egyptian writers rendered that name into Greek as Lamaris or Labaris, and recorded that he built the labyrinth in the Fayum as his own monument. The building may be named after the man. And the man is the reason this whole story matters, because Amenemhat III was not a king remembered for conquest. He was remembered for engineering, which brings us to the first clue and the first time somebody proved Herodotus right by putting a shovel in the ground. Here is where it gets strange. In the same section of his account, Herodotus describes the lake beside the labyrinth. He calls it Lake Moeris, and he makes 2 claims about it. The first is that the lake was not natural. He says it was dug by hand. The second claim is the one that got him mocked. He says that in the middle of the water stood 2 pyramids, rising high above the surface, and on top of each one sat a colossal stone figure on a throne. 2 pyramids standing in a lake, with giants sitting on top of them. For 2,000 years, that line was the single best piece of evidence that Herodotus was either lied to or making things up. There are no pyramids in the Fayum Lake. There never were. Scholars used it as the example when they wanted to explain why you should not trust his numbers. Then, in 1888, an English archaeologist named Flinders Petrie went to a village a few kilometers north of Hawara called Biahmu, where locals had always said there were 2 odd stone ruins in the fields. Petrie dug. He found 2 enormous stone platforms, massive, sloping-sided constructions, built in courses of dressed stone. And around them, in fragments, he found the remains of two colossal seated statues of Amenemhat III, carved in quartzite, each one roughly 11 to 12 meters tall on its base, sitting on a throne, facing out over the floodplain. Now, put yourself in a boat during the inundation, at the height of the flood, in a season when the water reached across that ground. You are looking at two steep-sided stone monuments rising out of open water, with giant seated figures on top of them. He was not lying, he was not exaggerating, he was describing exactly what he saw from the water in the flood season, and he described it so accurately that a man with a spade found it 23 centuries later using his directions. That is the first clue, and it does something to the rest of the account, because it means the standard defense that Herodotus was a gullible tourist repeating tall tales does not survive contact with the ground. On the one detail that was easiest to check and most obviously ridiculous, he was right. So, when the same man, in the same passage, about the same site, says there are 1,500 rooms under his feet, the question is no longer whether he was fooled. The question is, what is down there? That brings us to the second clue, and this one is about whether the ancient descriptions were physically possible at all. Strabo's claim about the roofs is the one that specialists always flag as impossible. Roofs of single stones, covered corridors, each spanned by one monolithic slab. No wood in the entire complex. Egyptologists have generally treated that as a Greek visitor being impressed by big architraves and rounding up. So go and look at what the builders at that exact site were actually capable of, because the evidence is sitting 200 meters away, under the pyramid. Petrie spent 2 brutal seasons tunneling into the Hawara pyramid in 1888 and 1889, crawling through wet sand and collapsed brick to reach the chamber underneath it. Other expeditions had tried and failed. When he finally broke through, what he found is still one of the strangest pieces of engineering in Egypt. The chamber is not built, it is carved. It is a single block of yellow quartzite, hollowed out from the inside like a box, roughly 6.7 meters long, 2.4 meters wide, with walls about 60 centimeters thick. Petrie estimated the weight of that one hollowed block at around 110 tons. Quartzite, not limestone. One of the hardest stones the Egyptians ever worked, and they worked it with copper and stone tools. Then they sealed it. And the way they sealed it is the part people miss. The lid was a quartzite slab of roughly 45 tons, and it could not be lowered by muscle. So the builders supported it on a bed of dry sand held in side galleries. When the time came, the sand was released and the sand drained out, and the slab came down slowly, evenly, under its own weight, into place. That is not a stack of rocks. That is a mechanism. Above it, they laid limestone roof beams of roughly 50 tons each in a gabled arrangement, and above those, they threw a brick arch to carry the mass of the pyramid. So, when Strabo says the passages next door were roofed with single stones of extraordinary size, we now know for certain that the crew working that ground was moving and placing single stones of 45 and 50 tons as a matter of routine. Their normal working unit was a slab heavier than a loaded truck. For decades, scholars dismissed that description as symbolic. The engineering under the pyramid says it was a specification. That is clue 2. If this is the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe now, because clue 3 is where the story stops being about ancient books and starts being about what somebody found and then buried. Because there is a problem sitting in the middle of all this. If the building was that large, that solid, and that famous, where did it go? Herodotus saw it, Strabo saw it, Pliny wrote about it, ancient visitors ranked it above the pyramids. And today, there is nothing there. No columns, no walls, no plan, nothing you could photograph and call a ruin. Petrie went looking for it in 1888, and what he found south of the pyramid is the single most important physical fact in this entire story. He found a platform, an artificial stone surface, enormous, flat, running roughly 300 meters by 250 meters, about 1,000 feet by 800, something on the order of 77,000 square meters of worked stone, larger in footprint than any temple still standing in Egypt today. And on top of it, spread across the whole area, was a thick layer of limestone chips. Petrie's conclusion was the obvious one, and it stood as the answer for over a century. The chips were quarry waste. The labyrinth had been used as a stone mine. Its blocks had been carried off to build the Greek and Roman town nearby, and the plundering went on so long that in the 19th century, blocks were still being hauled from the site to build a railway. The building had not been lost. It had been eaten. What Petrie was standing on was its foundation, scraped bare with the crumbs of the demolition still lying on top. Case closed. For 120 years, that was the textbook answer. But that explanation has a problem. In fact, it has two, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The first problem is Herodotus. He said the building had 2 levels, and that the lower one was underground and contained 1,500 chambers. Quarrymen are not archaeologists. They take what is easy. They take what is standing, in daylight, where a cart can reach. Nobody in antiquity mined stone by excavating downward through meters of sand and then hauling 40-ton slabs vertically out of a hole. And by Roman times, the water in the Fayum had already begun to rise. Whatever was below the ground level was, from a quarryman's point of view, worthless. The demolition explains the missing upper floor. It does not explain the missing lower one. The second problem is that flat stone surface itself, and this is the reframe that turns the whole story over. Petrie called it a foundation. Foundations sit underneath buildings. That is a reasonable reading if you have already decided the building is gone. But go back to Strabo. He said the covered ways were roofed with single stones of extraordinary size. Ask yourself what a roof made of enormous stone slabs looks like after 3,500 years of sand, salt, silt, and collapse. It looks like a continuous artificial stone surface. Flat, featureless, sealed. A pavement. Exactly what Petrie described, measured, mapped, and interpreted as a base. So here is the question that a Belgian researcher named Louis de Cordier put on the table. What if Petrie was not standing on the foundation of the labyrinth? What if he was standing on the roof of it? That is the idea the 2008 expedition went to Hawara to test. And this is where the story stops being about interpretation of old books. In February and March of 2008, with permission from the Supreme Council of Antiquities, then headed by Zahi Hawass, a team of geophysicists from Egypt's National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics went out onto Petrie's platform with survey equipment. De Cordier funded and coordinated the project. Ghent University handled scientific interpretation. The plan was deliberately non-destructive. Nobody was going to break the stone surface, because if the surface really was a roof, breaking it would wreck what it was covering. So they scanned through it. They ran ground-penetrating radar. They ran electrical resistivity tomography, which maps how easily current passes through the ground and reads dense stone very differently from soil. They ran very low-frequency electromagnetic sounding. 3 independent methods, different physics, cross-checking each other. The first thing they found was bad news. The groundwater at Hawara sits only 4 to 5 meters below the surface, and it is saline. Salt water is close to the worst possible environment for radar. It absorbs the signal and turns everything beneath it into fog. The team said so plainly in the report. And through the fog, at a depth of 8 to 12 meters, they got a return anyway. A grid. Vertical walls, some of them several meters thick, running in straight lines and crossing, forming shapes the report described as almost closed rooms. The material read as very high resistivity, the kind of reading you would expect from granite. The structure did not appear as an isolated anomaly in one corner of the survey. It extended across hectares of ground, south of the pyramid, in the same zone Petrie mapped, under the artificial stone surface, which had to be reconsidered, in the report's own language, as the roof of the still existing labyrinth. Read that phrase again. Still existing. The findings were written up in the spring of 2008 and published in the Journal of the Egyptian Geophysics Institute that carried out the work. In October 2008, the team presented the results publicly in a lecture at Ghent University, with the Belgian press in the room. And then everything stopped. Shortly after that lecture, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities put a halt to all communication of the findings. The stated reason was Egyptian national security. No further public release, no press, no follow-up statement. Decordier waited. He waited for the Egyptian authorities to publish the full results themselves, as he had been led to expect. He waited for 2 years. By June of 2010, it was clear that no official release was coming. So he built a website and put the material out himself. There has been no excavation, no trench, no coring. In a field where the depth of the target is known to within a few meters, nobody has sunk a borehole and dropped a camera down it, which is not an exotic operation. It is the sort of thing done routinely at sites all over the world, at a cost that would be a rounding error against what Egypt spends on a single museum exhibit. Later surveys have circled the same ground with newer technology, including satellite-based imaging and a private survey company brought in after the 2008 work. According to people involved in that later effort, participants were asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement lasting 10 years. It was surveyed, it was mapped, and then it went quiet. Now, does this prove there is an intact 3,000-room maze under the Fayum with sealed archives waiting in the dark? Probably not. And it is worth being honest about why, because the weak version of this story is the one that gets told badly. Geophysics at Hawara is genuinely difficult, and the team said so themselves. Saline groundwater sitting 4 meters down attenuates radar severely. Everything below it is degraded. Resistivity, contrasts that look like stone walls, can also be produced by natural limestone bedding, by dense mud brick, by cavities in the local rock, by the compacted chip layer itself, and by the boundaries between wet and dry ground. Geophysical readings are not photographs. They are interpretations. An interpretation without ground truth stays interpretation until somebody digs. The 2008 results were also never taken up and replicated by a major international team, never published in a mainstream archaeology journal, and never tested by excavation. That is a real gap, and it should be said out loud. And the mainstream reading of the site is not stupid. It is that Amenemhat III built an enormous mortuary temple beside his pyramid, unlike anything else in Egypt in scale, that it genuinely did impress Greek and Roman visitors into hyperbole, and that it was systematically quarried away over centuries because it was the largest pile of cut stone in the region, and a growing town needed building material. The chips are exactly what that process leaves behind. That explanation fits most of the evidence most of the time. But here is the thing that never gets said. Even the boring version of this story is enormous. He pulled papyrus out of it, including a copy of Homer written on a roll that had no business surviving. The site keeps handing over things that should not have lasted, and the largest structure on it has never been opened, and it is dissolving. That is the part almost nobody covers. The groundwater under Hawara has risen because of modern irrigation and canal management, and the water is salty. Salt water moves into porous stone, evaporates, and crystallizes, and the crystals split the stone from the inside. It happens quietly over decades. The pyramid's own entrance passage is flooded to a depth of around 6 meters because the Bar Yusuf Canal runs within about 30 meters of the monument. So the disagreement is not really about whether something is down there. Both sides agree there is a substantial buried structure. The disagreement is only about what it is. And while that argument continues, the salt keeps working. If any part of that lower level is intact and roofed, the stakes are hard to overstate. Herodotus said the walls of the chambers were covered with carving. Strabo said the roofs were single stones and there was no wood in the building, which is the specification you would write if your goal was permanence. A roofed underground level from the 12th dynasty, sealed since antiquity, would hold the largest surviving body of Middle Kingdom inscription ever found. And the Middle Kingdom is not just another period. It is the classical age of the Egyptian language, the era whose texts Egyptian scribes were still copying out as literary models 1,000 years later. We have that period mostly in fragments, in copies of copies, in pieces recovered from rubbish and reused blocks. And then there is the king himself. Amenemhat III is the ruler who reshaped the Fayum, the canal, the regulation of the flood, the conversion of a marsh basin into the most productive farmland in the ancient world. It is one of the earliest large-scale water engineering projects on the planet, and everything we know about how it was administered has been reconstructed from scraps. The building where that administration was run may still be standing in the dark, 8 meters under a field. And if that is true, it means our history is missing a chapter, not a lost civilization, something more uncomfortable than that. It means the ancient writers we dismissed as unreliable were reporting accurately, and we spent 2,000 years calling them liars because we had not bothered to look. So the last question is not what is inside. The last question is simpler and harder. Egypt has spent the past decade scanning pyramids with cosmic ray detectors, mapping voids with muon imaging, publishing every scan and every anomaly to global headlines. The technology exists. The permits exist. The location is known to within a few meters. Why has nobody put a camera down a hole in that field? The field is still there, sugarcane on one side, a canal running past on two, a mud brick pyramid dissolving quietly behind it, and a flat crust of stone and chips that nobody has lifted. 8 to 12 meters beneath it, salt water is seeping through the walls of rooms that no living person has entered. It was described, it was mapped, and then it was quiet. Herodotus asked to go down. They told him no. 24 centuries later, the answer has not changed. If you want to see what else has been found, recorded, and then quietly left in the ground, watch the next investigation on screen now.